Hey everybody, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast, and we have just taken a grand journey through the Old Testament and extra-biblical ancient texts, looking at the story of the Hebrew, Israelite, Jewish people and their temple, a building that they had good reason to believe God dwelt with them in. But that temple story has got a whole bunch of chapters going back to the tabernacle, a tent where God dwelt with them, to Solomon's grand first temple completed somewhere in the 900s BC, to the destruction of that temple under Nebuchadnezzar in the 500s BC, to the rebuilding of a much more modest temple under the Persians and Cyrus the Great later on in the 500s BC, all the way up to political turmoil that lands the Jewish people with Herod the Great in charge and his building of the grand temple complex that is the thing that was in place when Jesus and his disciples go to Jerusalem on the fateful trip that would see him executed on a cross. I think we are going to round out that story with our conversation today. So I've gone on long enough here with the intro. Let's have Jeff play some music and then we'll finish it up. So as you can see, the story of the temple has no analogy, probably, in your life or my life. There is no building that means what that building means to the original audience in the book of Matthew. The story starts all the way back just as they're walking out the door from Egypt. Supernatural things happen to confirm this building. It's an expression of the grandeur of the unified monarchy and the blessing of God under Solomon. It gets destroyed by the Babylonians. It gets rebuilt under the authority of the Persians. Alexander the Great shows up. The Egyptians under the Ptolemies control Jerusalem and the temple for a given time. Then the Seleucids from Syria end up controlling it for a time. Then the Jewish people rise up and throw them off under the Maccabees, and they create their own thing for a time. Then Pompey and the Romans show up, and Caesar controls it for a time. Then the Roman Republic breaks, and the new Roman Empire and Caesar Augustus and his successors control it for a time, until finally, once again, it is destroyed brick from brick entirely, save one little chunk of wall that still stands today. And to say the least, there's a lot of chapters and a lot of cultural, historical, theological meaning in that, not just because it's a very interesting, very old building, but because it's the building God ordained and where God lived uniquely amongst his chosen people. You might recall a couple hundred episodes ago, I was doing one of those things where I try to articulate a case for an empathetic view of the Pharisees, who, yeah, they're wrong, but you can kind of get how they're wrong. And in that episode, I was talking about what their strategy is and where they were coming from. And their point of view was such that they looked at what went wrong with the disobedience of the Israelite people that led to Nebuchadnezzar's destruction of the temple. And they're like, we just didn't do what God said. We didn't obey the law closely enough. And then the second temple gets built, and it doesn't seem like God shows up the same way. And so this group of scribes and Pharisees and teachers of the law and all of this crowd gradually developed this culture and this game plan based on only a partial reading of the book of Haggai that says, we just got to tighten things down big time. We got to make rules on top of rules to make sure we don't even come close to violating any rules so that we will never invoke the judgment of God against us again, and so that this temple will never be destroyed, and so that we can be right with God, and so that the terms of all the great covenants of the Old Testament can be fulfilled. And in the Pharisees' zeal to achieve this noble end through their own hard work and grit and discipline and force, if need be, against their own people to get them in line with their understandings of how things ought to be in terms of religious behavior throughout the day and civil codes throughout your life. And so what the Pharisees are trying to do in a lot of ways is noble. This is a nice idea. They want to get things right where they got things wrong. And if they have got to demonstrate absolute authority over every detail of people's lives, and they need to write rules where there aren't even actual rules from God to do it, to make sure God can see how committed we really are to avoid this kind of catastrophe in the future, well, doggone it, they will stop at nothing. This is a matter of the well-being of our people to do religion this way. Well, after a while, you're married to that. You're committed to it. You've painted yourself into a corner because that's your strategy. It's your game plan. And as a result, there can't be any off-ramp for that. So when Jesus shows up and is like, Yeah, your game plan has twisted up your religion and your understanding of God. And now it's just putting boundaries and barriers between people and God. You got it all wrong. They're going to be furious. One, because they got a ton of time and energy and reputation into it. Two, because they respect the temple. They understand the story and the grit and the hard work and the money and the loss and the blood and everything that has gone into making this temple what it is today. And you, Jesus, simply do not appreciate it. You don't appreciate it to the point that it could even be said you blaspheme against it. How dare you? An attack on our plan for how to make sure the people behave well enough that we get to keep this temple is an attack against God himself. It would be better if Jesus were dead. That's how they reason to that. And understanding the story of the temple and how we got here helps us understand why this thing is going nuclear and why the fate of the temple is such an important point in what Jesus has to speak to before he faces trial and eventually his execution. In light of all of this, I think we are now in much better shape to understand Matthew chapter 24 and move forward. This is the biggest historical detour we have ever taken. You are awesome. I think this is a feature, not a bug of this format. I know history isn't necessarily everybody's cup of tea, but in this case, I think it is so important to understanding Jesus' teachings. So especially for those of you for whom it's a little bit of a grind to take this kind of a jaunt through the backstory, I just want to express my gratitude because I want to do this right together. Remember, the goal of this exercise between you and me is not for you to come out at the end and be like, okay, now I know what Matt thinks about everything, and he's the one who bought the microphone and did the show, so he must be right, and I am now persuaded of his thing. That's not what we're doing here. The goal is to understand it, knowing full well that as we try to wrap our brains around exactly what the text is as best as we can, we might all land in very different places, and we've chosen from the outset to be at peace with that. This, then, has been our due diligence, and I had so much fun doing it. So thanks for going there with me. I'm excited to move forward with you into what's next. If you like this kind of internet, I would be so incredibly grateful if you would consider joining the people who've decided to support it at patreon.com/the TMBH podcast. If not, that is no problem whatsoever. I'm just glad you're here. Thanks for hanging out with me. Matthew 24 to come. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.